Chapter 1. My bipolar journey begins. Page 1. I still remember the first time I noticed something was off. It wasn't one big moment, no sudden collapse or dramatic breakdown. It was a gradual unraveling, like a sweater slowly coming apart at the seams. On the outside, I probably seemed fine. I could laugh, work, interact, and even enjoy life. But inside, I was living on a seesaw. One day, I would feel invincible, my mind racing 100 miles an hour, ideas flowing endlessly, creativity spilling out of me. I'd stay up all night because, really, who needs sleep when the world is this exciting? I felt like I was standing on top of a mountain, looking down at everything I could conquer. But then, as quickly as it came, that feeling would vanish. Like the sun disappearing behind clouds, everything would turn dark. The high would crash into a deep, paralyzing low. At first, I thought it was normal. Doesn't everyone have good days and bad days? Maybe I was just being dramatic or overly sensitive. I'd tell myself to snap out of it, try to push through, act like everything was okay. But no matter how hard I tried to hold it together, I couldn't keep the facade up forever. It felt like I was being dragged underwater, and I couldn't find my way back to the surface. For years, I went without a diagnosis. I floated through life, swinging between intense highs and debilitating lows, confused and frustrated. It's hard to explain bipolar disorder to someone who's never felt it. It's not just about mood swings. It's an entire shift in perception. One moment you're on top of the world, and the next, you can't even find the energy to get out of bed. And what makes it worse is the unpredictability of it all. It's not like you wake up knowing what kind of day it's going to be. It hits when it hits, and all you can do is brace yourself for the ride. I kept wondering, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just feel normal? There were days I would look at others and envy their stability, their sense of self that seemed so unwavering. It felt like I was always teetering on the edge of something dangerous, like I could never fully trust myself or my emotions. It was exhausting. Page 2. Looking back, I can see the signs were there long before I ever knew the name for what I was dealing with. Even as a child, I had moments of extreme emotion, joy so intense it made my heart race, followed by crushing sadness that I didn't know how to explain. But back then, no one talked about mental health. It wasn't a conversation we had at the dinner table, and certainly not something anyone thought could affect a child. As I got older, the swings became more noticeable, but I still managed to hide them. I thought I was doing a good job of keeping it together, masking the chaos inside me with jokes and distractions. But the mask started to crack when the lows got lower, and I couldn't pretend anymore. I was spiraling, and I didn't even know it. The breaking point came when I couldn't function in my day-to-day life. I started missing work, withdrawing from friends, and isolating myself. It felt like I was drowning in an ocean, and no matter how hard I swam, I couldn't find the shore. My mind was my worst enemy, and it seemed like there was no escape. When I finally sought help, I was hesitant, even ashamed. I didn't want to admit that something was wrong with me, but the truth is, admitting it was the first step toward healing. I sat in the doctor's office, nervous, fidgeting, waiting for answers. After what felt like an eternity of tests and questions, I got the diagnosis: bipolar disorder. At first, it was a relief. There was a name for what I was experiencing. I wasn't just crazy or dramatic. There was a reason for the turmoil inside me. But then came the fear. How do I live with this? Will I ever feel normal? The label was both comforting and terrifying. It felt like my world had shifted, but I still didn't know how to make sense of it. Page 3. The more I learned about bipolar disorder, the more I realized it wasn't just about managing the symptoms. It was about understanding the roots of it, why my mind and emotions were wired this way. But at that time, all I wanted was a quick fix, something to make the pain stop. I didn't yet understand that healing would be a process, a journey that required more than just medication or therapy. It required me to dig deep into my past, to confront the things I had buried for so long. That's when I stumbled upon Dr. Gabor Maté. I can't remember exactly how I found his work, whether it was a podcast, a book, or a random video, but his words struck a chord with me. He spoke about trauma in a way that made me pause and reflect. He wasn't just talking about the obvious kinds of trauma, abuse, neglect, or loss, but about the subtle ways we all experience pain in our lives. He talked about how unresolved trauma can live in our bodies, shaping our emotions, our thoughts, and even our health. I had never thought about my bipolar disorder in connection with trauma before. It seemed too far-fetched, but the more I listened to Dr. Maté, the more it made sense. My emotional instability wasn't just a chemical imbalance or a genetic curse. It was my body and mind reacting to things I had never fully processed. Page 4. Dr. Maté's concept of the mind-body connection was a revelation to me. I had always treated my mental illness as something separate from the rest of me, as if my brain was broken, but the rest of me was fine. But he explained that trauma isn't just in the mind, it's in the body too. The way we store pain, the way our bodies react to stress, it's all connected. For the first time, I started thinking about my bipolar disorder differently. Maybe it wasn't something I had to fight or fix. Maybe it was my body's way of trying to tell me something, to point me toward the pain I had never addressed. Dr. Maté's teachings made me realize that healing wasn't just about controlling symptoms. It was about going inward, understanding the root causes, and being compassionate with myself through the process. I started to see my mental health not as a battle to be won, but as a journey to be taken. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. But the more I embraced this mindset, the more I found relief, not from the disorder itself, but from the constant war I was waging against myself. Page 5. My journey with bipolar disorder is still ongoing, and there are days when it's hard to see the progress I've made. But I've come to realize that healing isn't a straight line. There are setbacks and there are breakthroughs. And through it all, I remind myself of one thing Dr. Maté said that has stuck with me. Trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. That's the key. It's not about what happened to me in the past or what I can't change. It's about how I process it now, how I allow myself to heal. And in that healing, I found hope. Page 6, affirmation. I am more than my diagnosis. I am healing with every breath I take. Chapter 2, the burden of trauma. Page 1, I didn't think much about trauma when I was first diagnosed. What did trauma have to do with bipolar disorder? Trauma was for people who had gone through war or terrible abuse or devastating loss. My life didn't seem to fit that picture. Sure, I had difficult experiences, but I hadn't suffered in any dramatic way that I thought would leave lasting damage. But the more I dove into Dr. Maté's work, the more I started to understand trauma in a broader sense. He talks about trauma not just as an event, but as the impact of that event on our emotional and physical health. It's not about what happens to you. It's about how your body and mind respond to what happens. And that hit me hard, because while I didn't have the kind of trauma you'd see in movies or hear about in tragic stories, I realized that I had been carrying my own invisible burdens for years. It's the small, repeated hurts, the things we brush off or tell ourselves to get over, that often leave the deepest scars. For me, it was growing up feeling like I had to be perfect, like I had to constantly prove my worth. It was the times I felt alone, misunderstood, or judged, the moments when I felt unsafe emotionally, even if everything seemed fine on the surface. Trauma isn't always about what someone did to you. Sometimes it's about what you didn't get, the love, the support, the validation that you needed to feel whole. As Dr. Maté says, trauma is stored in the body. It's not just a memory you can push away. It lingers, and it shapes how you think, how you feel, and even how your body reacts to stress. I began to see how much of my bipolar disorder, the mood swings, the chaos, wasn't just some random malfunction of my brain. It was my body trying to cope with all the unresolved pain that I had never acknowledged. Page 2. Once I started recognizing the role of trauma in my life, everything changed. It didn't make my bipolar disorder disappear, but it made me see it in a new light. My mind and body weren't betraying me. They were trying to protect me. Every manic episode, every depressive crash was a signal that something deeper was going on. But here's the thing. I didn't want to face that. It's hard to look back at your life and admit that things hurt more than you let on. It's even harder to acknowledge that those hurts didn't just go away. They stuck with me, and in many ways, they shaped who I became. I had spent years trying to outrun my pain, thinking if I just ignored it or kept moving forward, it would eventually fade. But trauma doesn't work like that. Dr. Maté talks about how unresolved trauma becomes a kind of emotional baggage that we carry with us, even when we're not aware of it. It's like walking through life with an invisible weight on your shoulders, pulling you down when you least expect it. And for me, that weight often showed up in the form of manic highs, followed by crushing lows. For a long time, I tried to pretend the past didn't matter. But the truth is, until I started confronting my trauma, I couldn't fully understand or manage my bipolar disorder. I had to stop running from the things that hurt me and start paying attention to what my body and mind were telling me. Page 3. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Confronting trauma means going back to those places you've been avoiding, the painful memories, the uncomfortable emotions, the fears you've buried deep down. I had to face the fact that some of the wounds I carried weren't going to just heal on their own. They needed my attention. One of the things Dr. Maté emphasizes is that healing from trauma is about reconnecting with your body. For years, I had treated my body like an enemy, like it was something that was constantly betraying me with its moods and instability. But as I started to work through my trauma, I began to see my body differently. My body wasn't betraying me. It was protecting me. It was doing everything it could to help me survive the emotional pain I didn't know how to handle. And once I started listening to my body, really listening, I realized that it had been telling me all along what I needed to heal. I started paying attention to the physical sensations that came with my emotions. The tightness in my chest when I felt anxious. The heaviness in my limbs when I was depressed. The adrenaline that surged through me during a manic episode. These weren't random symptoms. They were my body's way of communicating with me. And for the first time, I was ready to listen. Page 4. Healing from trauma is a process. It's not something you can rush or force. It requires patience, compassion, and a willingness to be vulnerable. And that's what Dr. Maté's work taught me most of all, the importance of being kind to myself during this journey. For so long, I had been angry at myself for not being normal. I had blamed myself for my mood swings, for my inability to control my emotions, for the chaos that seemed to follow me everywhere. But when I started seeing my bipolar disorder as a response to trauma, everything shifted. I stopped blaming myself and started understanding myself. I began to realize that my mind and body were doing the best they could with the tools they had. And the more I embraced that, the more I found peace. I also learned that healing doesn't mean erasing the past or getting rid of your pain. It means learning how to carry it in a way that doesn't weigh you down. It means acknowledging what you've been through and giving yourself permission to heal at your own pace. That's what I'm still working on every day. Some days are easier than others, There are times when the trauma feels distant, like a faded memory, and then there are days when it feels like it's right there, in the room with me, reminding me of everything I've been through. But now, instead of running from it, I face it, and with each day, I'm getting stronger. Page 5. The biggest lesson I've learned from Dr. Maté's work is that healing isn't about fixing yourself. It's about understanding yourself. It's about learning to be gentle with the parts of you that are still hurting and giving yourself the space to heal in your own time. I used to think that if I could just fix my bipolar disorder, everything would be okay. But now I know that healing isn't about getting rid of the symptoms. It's about getting to the root of the pain that caused them in the first place. And while I still have a long way to go, I know that I'm on the right path. Every day I'm learning to listen to my body, to pay attention to the signals it's sending me, and to honor the process of healing. It's not easy, and there are still days when I struggle, but for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful. Page 6, affirmation. My trauma does not define me. My healing does. Chapter 3, discovering Dr. Gabor Maté. Page 1. The first time I came across Dr. Gabor Maté's name, I wasn't looking for answers about trauma. In fact, I didn't even know who he was. I was scrolling through a list of books and stumbled upon one of his titles. Something about it caught my attention, but I didn't dive in right away. At that point, I wasn't ready to acknowledge the connection between my mental health and my past. But then I started hearing his name everywhere. Podcasts, articles, conversations with friends. It was like the universe was pointing me toward his work. I finally gave in and decided to listen to one of his talks online. I didn't expect it to resonate as deeply as it did. In fact, I wasn't expecting much at all. But within the first few minutes of listening to him, I felt like he was speaking directly to me. He was calm, compassionate, and incredibly wise. The way he talked about trauma, not as something shameful or uncommon, but as a shared human experience, made me sit up and pay attention. Dr. Maté's work is all about understanding the root causes of illness, both physical and mental. He doesn't just focus on the symptoms or the diagnosis. He looks deeper, asking what led to those symptoms in the first place. And when I started applying that lens to my own life, everything shifted. Page 2. Up until that point, I had always seen my bipolar disorder as something isolated, something separate from the rest of my life. I didn't think about it in connection with my childhood, my relationships, or my emotional experiences. I saw it as a problem to be fixed, an illness to be managed. But Dr. Maté challenged that perspective. He talked about how many of the mental health issues we struggle with today, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, are often rooted in unhealed trauma. He explained that trauma doesn't have to be something dramatic or extreme to have a lasting impact. It can be subtle, the kind of pain that we carry with us for years without even realizing it. And that's when it clicked for me. For the first time, I started to see my bipolar disorder not just as a random illness, but as a response to something deeper. It wasn't my brain malfunctioning for no reason. It was my mind and body trying to cope with emotional wounds that had never fully healed. Page 3. I began to devour everything I could find from Dr. Maté. Books, interviews, videos, anything that could help me understand more about trauma and its effects. The more I listened, the more I felt like he was helping me piece together a puzzle that I had been struggling with for years. One of the things that really stood out to me was his view on addiction. Now, I didn't consider myself addicted to anything in the traditional sense, but Dr. Maté talks about addiction not just in terms of drugs or alcohol, but in terms of any behavior we use to numb our pain. And that hit me hard, because while I wasn't addicted to substances, I had definitely found ways to numb myself, whether it was through overworking, avoiding my emotions, or distracting myself with constant activity, I was using those behaviors to avoid the deeper pain I didn't want to face. And in a way, that was its own form of addiction. Page 4. The more I reflected on it, the more I saw the connection between my coping mechanisms and my bipolar disorder. The manic episodes were a way of escaping the pain, of numbing myself with the rush of energy and creativity. And the depressive episodes were the aftermath, the inevitable crash that came when I could no longer outrun my emotions. Dr. Maté's work made me realize that in order to heal, I had to stop running. I had to stop trying to numb myself and start facing the pain head on. And that was terrifying, but it was also liberating. I started to see my bipolar disorder in a new light. Instead of viewing it as a curse or a burden, I began to see it as a message from my body, a signal that something deeper needed my attention. My moods weren't just random fluctuations. They were connected to my emotions, my past, and the unresolved trauma I had been carrying for years. Page 5. Dr. Maté doesn't offer easy answers or quick fixes. In fact, he often talks about how healing is a long, slow process. But what I appreciated most about his approach was the compassion he showed for those of us who are struggling. He doesn't see mental illness as a weakness or a flaw. He sees it as a response to pain. And in that understanding, there's a deep sense of compassion. For the first time, I felt like someone understood what I was going through. And more importantly, I started to understand myself. I wasn't broken. I wasn't beyond help. I was just a person who had been hurt, and my body and mind were doing their best to protect me. Page 6, affirmation. The more I learn about myself, the closer I get to peace. Chapter 4, the mind-body connection. Page 1, one of the most profound lessons I learned from Dr. Maté was the idea that the mind and body are deeply connected. This wasn't something I had ever really considered before. I had always thought of my bipolar disorder as a mental illness, something that lived in my brain and didn't have much to do with the rest of me. But Dr. Maté challenged that idea in a way that completely changed my perspective. He talks about how trauma affects not just our emotions, but our physical bodies as well. It's not just something we feel mentally, it's something we carry in our muscles, our nervous system, our organs. Our bodies remember the pain, even if our minds try to forget. And when that pain goes unaddressed, it can manifest in all kinds of ways, including mental illness. When I started thinking about my bipolar disorder in this way, it made so much sense. The mood swings, the anxiety, the depression. It wasn't just happening in my mind. My whole body was reacting to the trauma I had experienced, and it was trying to communicate with me through these symptoms. Chapter 4, the mind-body connection. Page 1. One of the most profound lessons I learned from Dr. Gabor Maté was the idea that the mind and body are deeply connected. At first, this sounded a bit abstract to me. I had always thought of my bipolar disorder as something purely mental, an imbalance in the brain that had nothing to do with my physical health. But as I delved deeper into his work, I realized how narrow that view was. Dr. Maté talks about how trauma affects us not only emotionally, but physically. It isn't just something that lives in our memories or thoughts. It's something our bodies remember long after the event has passed. This concept of trauma being stored in the body was a game changer for me. It was like a light bulb going off. Suddenly, my struggles made more sense. I had always experienced my bipolar disorder in a very physical way, but I never really connected the dots. The manic episodes came with a rush of energy, almost like my body was vibrating. I couldn't sit still. I felt invincible, but that energy was overwhelming. Then, the depressive episodes would hit, and my body would feel like lead, exhausted, heavy, like I was sinking into the ground. For years, I thought these physical sensations were just side effects of my mental illness. But when I began to understand that my body was reacting to unresolved trauma, It completely changed how I saw myself. My bipolar disorder wasn't just a brain issue. It was my whole body trying to communicate with me. Page 2. The more I reflected on this, the more I realized that my body had been sending me signals for years, and I had been ignoring them. I had spent so much time treating my mind as the problem, without paying attention to the physical signs my body was giving me. The anxiety, the sleepless nights, the constant tension in my muscles, all of it was my body's way of saying, something is wrong. Dr. Maté describes how trauma is stored in the nervous system, creating a state of chronic stress that affects our overall health. When we don't address our emotional pain, our bodies carry that burden. It's like living in a constant state of fight or flight, even when there's no immediate danger. Our bodies become hypervigilant, always on edge, always bracing for something. When I started to look at my bipolar disorder through this lens, I began to see the connections between my mental and physical health more clearly. The manic episodes weren't just bursts of mental energy, they were my body trying to cope with unresolved pain by pushing itself into overdrive. And the depressive episodes weren't just a mental crash. They were my body's way of shutting down after being stretched too thin for too long. Page 3. This realization brought me a sense of relief. It didn't make the symptoms go away, but it gave me a new way of understanding them. Instead of feeling like my body was betraying me, I started to see it as an ally, trying its best to protect me from pain I hadn't dealt with. But this also meant I needed to start taking care of my body in ways I hadn't before. I began exploring practices like yoga, meditation, and deep breathing, things I used to dismiss as fluff or not serious enough to help with something as severe as bipolar disorder. But the more I engaged with these practices, the more I saw their value. Yoga, for instance, wasn't just about stretching or physical exercise. It was a way to reconnect with my body, to release the tension I had been holding for years. Meditation wasn't just about calming my mind. It was about being present with my emotions without trying to run from them. And deep breathing helped me soothe my nervous system, bringing me out of that constant state of alertness. These practices didn't fix my bipolar disorder, but they helped me create a sense of balance. They gave me tools to regulate my emotions and manage the physical sensations that came with my mood swings. And, most importantly, they helped me listen to my body in a way I never had before. Page 4. Dr. Maté often talks about how our culture teaches us to disconnect from our bodies, especially when we're in pain. We're taught to push through, to ignore the discomfort, to keep going no matter what. But healing, he says, requires the opposite. It requires us to slow down, to pay attention, to be present with our bodies and our emotions. This was one of the hardest lessons for me to learn. I had spent so many years running from my emotions, from my pain, from my past. I thought that if I could just keep moving, I could stay ahead of it all. But Dr. Maté taught me that healing doesn't happen when we're running. It happens when we stop, turn around, and face what we've been avoiding. It wasn't easy. In fact, there were moments when it felt unbearable. Facing the trauma that had been stored in my body for years wasn't something I could do overnight. It required patience and, more than anything, compassion for myself and for the parts of me that were still hurting. But with each step, I started to feel more connected to myself, to my body, and to the world around me. It was like waking up from a long sleep where I had been numb to everything, including my own pain. And once I started paying attention, I realized that my body had been trying to wake me up for years. I just hadn't been listening. Page 5. This new understanding of the mind-body connection gave me hope. It made me realize that healing wasn't just about managing my bipolar disorder with medication and therapy, though those things were still important. It was about going deeper, into my body, into my emotions, into the trauma I had been carrying for so long. I started to see my symptoms not as something to be fought or controlled, but as messages. My body was telling me what it needed to heal. And the more I listened, the more I realized that healing wasn't something I could force or rush. It was a process, one that required time, patience, and a deep commitment to self-care. I began to understand that healing from trauma wasn't just about relieving the symptoms. It was about reconnecting with myself in a way I hadn't before. It was about understanding that my body, mind, and emotions were all part of the same system, and that healing one part required healing them all. Page 6, affirmation. My mind and body are working together to bring me peace. Chapter 5, the hidden wounds of trauma. One of the most eye-opening concepts I learned from Dr. Maté is that trauma doesn't always show up in obvious ways. Sometimes the wounds we carry are hidden, buried deep inside us, and we don't even realize they're there until something forces us to confront them. For most of my life, I didn't think I had any real trauma. I hadn't gone through anything you'd typically associate with trauma. No major accidents, no violence, no abuse. Sure, I had some tough moments growing up, but nothing that I thought would leave lasting damage. So when I first heard Dr. Maté talk about trauma, I didn't think it applied to me. But as I listened to him describe the subtle ways trauma can affect us, I started to wonder. He talks about how trauma isn't just about what happens to us. It's about how we internalize those experiences, how they shape the way we see ourselves and the world. And that got me thinking. Maybe there were things I had overlooked, moments from my past that I had brushed off as no big deal, but were actually shaping the way I lived. Page 2. Dr. Maté describes trauma as anything that leaves us feeling unsafe, unloved, or unworthy. It's not just the big, obvious events. It's the moments of emotional neglect, the times when our needs weren't met, the feelings we were taught to suppress. And as I reflected on my own life, I realized that there were plenty of those moments. I grew up in a family where emotions weren't really talked about. If you were sad, you kept it to yourself. If you were angry, you hid it. And if you were struggling, well, you just powered through. There wasn't a lot of space for vulnerability, for admitting that you were hurting or that you needed help. And so I learned to keep my emotions locked inside. As a child, that made me feel invisible at times. I would have these big feelings, sadness, anger, fear, but I didn't know how to express them. And when I tried, I often felt like I was being too much, like my emotions were a burden on the people around me. So I stopped trying. I bottled everything up, telling myself that I had to be strong, that I had to handle things on my own. But those emotions didn't just go away. They stayed with me, buried deep inside, shaping how I saw myself and how I related to the world. I didn't realize it at the time, but those were the hidden wounds I carried into adulthood. Page 3. As an adult, those hidden wounds started to show up in ways I didn't expect. I would find myself reacting to things that seemed insignificant, feeling hurt, angry, or rejected over something small. I didn't understand why I was so sensitive, why certain situations seemed to trigger such strong emotions. I thought I was just overreacting, being too emotional or irrational. But when I started to learn more about trauma, I realized that those strong reactions were coming from a deeper place. They were the result of unresolved pain, old wounds that I had never fully processed. My body was remembering things that my mind had long forgotten, and it was reacting to protect me from getting hurt again. This was a huge breakthrough for me. It made me realize that my emotions weren't irrational or out of control. They were signals. They were my body's way of telling me that something was wrong, that there was pain I hadn't dealt with, and that I needed to pay attention. Page 4. I started to recognize the patterns, the times when I would get overly upset in relationships, when I would feel abandoned or rejected over something small, it wasn't about the current situation. It was about the old wounds I was still carrying, the ones that had never fully healed. And once I understood that, I started to approach my emotions differently. Instead of trying to suppress them or push them away, I began to listen to them. I started asking myself, where is this emotion coming from? What is it trying to tell me? And more often than not, the answer was tied to something from my past, an old hurt, a moment of rejection, a time when I felt unloved or unseen. Dr. Maté talks about how trauma can create emotional patterns that we repeat throughout our lives. We get stuck in cycles of pain, reacting to new situations in ways that are rooted in old experiences. And until we address the trauma at the core, we keep repeating those patterns over and over again. Page 5. Recognizing these patterns was a huge step forward for me. It didn't make the pain go away, but it gave me a sense of control. I realized that I wasn't doomed to repeat the same cycles forever. I had the power to break free, to heal the hidden wounds that were shaping my life. But healing those wounds wasn't easy. It required me to go back to places I didn't want to revisit, to face emotions I had buried for years. It meant allowing myself to feel the pain, the sadness, the anger, instead of pushing it away. And that was terrifying, but it was also liberating. The more I allowed myself to feel, the more I started to heal. It wasn't an overnight process. There were setbacks, and there were days when it felt like I was making no progress at all. But with each step, I felt a little lighter, a little more in control of my emotions, and a little more at peace with myself. Page 6. Affirmation. I am releasing the hidden wounds one day at a time. Chapter 6. Finding emotional healing. Page 1. When I first started my healing journey, my idea of healing was tied to control. I wanted to control my bipolar disorder, to manage the mood swings and the chaos inside my mind. I thought healing meant suppressing the extremes, reigning in the highs and lows until I felt normal. But the more I learned from Dr. Gabor Maté, the more I realized that healing wasn't about control, it was about acceptance. I had been trying to tame my emotions for years, convinced that if I could just keep them in check, I'd be okay. But every time I tried to suppress my feelings, they would come back even stronger. It was a constant cycle. Push down the emotions, pretend they didn't exist, and then watch them explode when I couldn't hold them back any longer. It was exhausting, and it wasn't working. That's when Dr. Maté's teachings about emotional healing started to make sense. He talks about how we often avoid feeling our emotions because they're uncomfortable, painful, or overwhelming. But by avoiding them, we're only making things worse. Healing, he says, comes from allowing ourselves to feel, and not just the good emotions, but all of them, the anger, the sadness, the fear, the grief. At first, this idea terrified me. I had spent so long running from my emotions that I didn't know how to just sit with them. But I knew that if I wanted to heal, I had to stop running. So I made the decision to start feeling, to really let myself experience the emotions I had been avoiding for so long. Page 2. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. When I first started allowing myself to feel, it was like opening a floodgate. All of the emotions I had been suppressing for years came rushing in, and it felt overwhelming. There were days when the sadness was so heavy, I could barely get out of bed. There were moments when the anger felt like it would consume me. And there were times when the fear of feeling those emotions made me want to retreat back into my old ways of avoidance. But Dr. Maté's words stayed with me. Healing isn't about avoiding the pain. It's about moving through it. So I kept going. I allowed myself to feel, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it felt like too much. And slowly, I started to notice something. The more I allowed myself to feel, the less power those emotions had over me. The sadness didn't consume me the way it used to. The anger didn't feel as uncontrollable. The fear didn't paralyze me. It wasn't that the emotions went away, they were still there, but they weren't as overwhelming. I realized that by allowing myself to feel, I was releasing the hold those emotions had on me. Page 3. Dr. Maté talks about how emotional healing isn't about getting rid of our emotions. It's about learning how to hold them with compassion. He says that when we suppress our emotions, we're essentially telling ourselves that those feelings aren't valid or acceptable. But when we allow ourselves to feel, we're giving ourselves permission to be human. For me, this was a revolutionary idea. I had always seen my emotions as something to be controlled, something that made me too much or not enough. But through Dr. Maté's teachings, I began to understand that my emotions were a natural part of who I am. They weren't something to be ashamed of or hidden. They were signals from my body and mind, telling me what I needed. The more I practiced emotional honesty, the more I started to trust myself. I learned to listen to my emotions without judgment, to ask myself, what is this feeling trying to tell me? Instead of running from the discomfort, I began to sit with it, to explore it, and to understand its origins. And in doing so, I found that many of my emotions were tied to unresolved pain that needed to be acknowledged and healed, not suppressed. Page 4, one of the most powerful realizations I had during this process was that healing wasn't linear. There were days when I felt like I was making great progress, and then there were days when it felt like I had taken 10 steps backward. But Dr. May's words reminded me that healing is a journey, not a destination. It's not about fixing ourselves. It's about learning to be with ourselves in all of our complexity. There were moments when the old patterns would resurface, when I would try to suppress my emotions or distract myself from the pain. But instead of beating myself up for it, I started to approach those moments with compassion. I reminded myself that healing takes time and that it's okay to have setbacks. One of the things Dr. Maté emphasizes is the importance of self-compassion in the healing process. He says that we can't heal if we're constantly judging ourselves or being harsh with ourselves. We need to create a space of kindness and understanding for our own healing to take place. And that's what I began to do. Instead of criticizing myself for feeling too much or for not being better yet, I started to speak to myself the way I would speak to a friend. I would remind myself that it's okay to feel, that it's okay to have bad days, and that healing is a process. And in doing so, I began to feel a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. Page 5. Finding emotional healing wasn't about eliminating my bipolar disorder or erasing the highs and lows. It was about learning to navigate those emotions with compassion and acceptance. I began to see my mood swings not as something to be feared, but as signals that my body and mind were giving me. They were telling me that something needed attention, that there was an emotion I needed to process, a wound I needed to heal. Dr. Maté's teachings gave me the tools to approach my emotions differently. Instead of fighting them, I began to work with them. I started to see my emotions as allies in my healing journey, rather than enemies to be defeated. And in doing so, I found a sense of peace and balance that I hadn't thought was possible. Healing is still a work in progress. There are days when I struggle, when the emotions feel overwhelming, and when I fall back into old patterns of avoidance. But now, I have the tools to bring myself back to a place of compassion and acceptance. I remind myself that healing isn't about perfection, it's about progress. And as long as I'm moving forward, even in small steps, I know I'm healing. Page 6, affirmation, it's safe for me to feel all my emotions. I am healing through them. Chapter 7, understanding bipolar disorder through trauma. Page 1. When I was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I saw it as a condition that I had to live with, something that was purely biological and out of my control. I assumed it was a genetic disorder, something I had inherited, and that I would need medication and therapy to manage the symptoms for the rest of my life. But after learning from Dr. Gabor Maté, I began to see my bipolar disorder through a different lens, one that included trauma as a key piece of the puzzle. Dr. Maté talks about how trauma, especially early childhood trauma, can shape our mental health in profound ways. He explains that trauma isn't always about a single catastrophic event. It can also be about ongoing emotional neglect, feelings of abandonment, or not having our emotional needs met as children. And when trauma goes unhealed, it can manifest in various ways, including mental health conditions like bipolar disorder. This was a radical shift in thinking for me. I had always thought of bipolar disorder as something I was born with, something that just happened to me. But as I learned more about trauma, I started to see how my emotional wounds from childhood might have contributed to the development of my mental health struggles. Page 2. One of the things that stood out to me in Dr. Maté's work was his emphasis on the mind-body connection in relation to trauma. He explains that when we experience trauma, especially in childhood, our bodies and brains adapt in ways that help us survive. These adaptations can include heightened emotional sensitivity, difficulty regulating emotions, and a tendency to dissociate from painful feelings. In many ways, these are the same symptoms that characterize bipolar disorder: intense mood swings, emotional highs and lows, and difficulty maintaining emotional balance. The more I reflected on my own experiences, the more I saw the connections. As a child, I often felt emotionally neglected. My family wasn't intentionally cruel or abusive, but there was a lack of emotional support. I didn't feel safe expressing my feelings, and as a result, I learned to bottle them up. I became hypervigilant, always scanning for signs that I was too much or not enough, always afraid of being rejected or abandoned. These patterns carried into adulthood, and they manifested in the extremes of my bipolar disorder. The manic episodes where I felt invincible and unstoppable were a way of compensating for the deep-seated fear of not being enough. The depressive episodes where I felt utterly hopeless were the result of years of emotional suppression, the weight of all the unprocessed pain I had been carrying. Page 3. Understanding the role of trauma in my bipolar disorder didn't make the symptoms go away, but it gave me a new way of relating to them. Instead of seeing my mood swings as random or out of control, I began to see them as messages, signals from my body and mind that something deeper was going on. Dr. Maté talks about how mental illness is often a manifestation of unhealed trauma. He explains that when we don't have the tools or the support to process our trauma, it gets stored in our bodies and brains, creating patterns of emotional dysregulation. This was exactly what I had experienced. My bipolar disorder wasn't just a chemical imbalance. It was a reflection of the unresolved trauma I had been carrying for years. This understanding helped me approach my bipolar disorder with more compassion. Instead of blaming myself for the mood swings or feeling ashamed of my diagnosis, I started to see my mental health struggles as part of a larger picture. I wasn't broken or defective. I was someone who had experienced trauma, and my body and mind were doing their best to cope with that pain. Page 4. One of the most important things I learned from Dr. Maté is that healing from trauma doesn't mean erasing our mental health struggles. It means understanding where they come from and learning how to care for ourselves in the midst of them. For so long, I had been focused on managing my bipolar disorder, trying to control the symptoms, prevent the manic episodes, and avoid the depressive crashes. But after learning about trauma, I began to shift my focus from control to healing. I started to ask myself, what does my body need right now? What emotions have I been suppressing? What past pain am I still carrying? This shift in perspective allowed me to start working with my emotions rather than against them. I began to see my mood swings as opportunities for healing. When I felt a manic episode coming on, I would pause and ask myself what I was trying to avoid. When I felt the weight of depression setting in, I would gently explore the feelings of sadness or grief that I had been holding inside. Page 5. This process wasn't easy, and it wasn't always clear-cut. There were times when the emotions felt too big to handle, when the pain felt too deep to face. But with each step, I felt a little more empowered. I began to trust my body and mind to guide me toward healing, rather than seeing them as something I had to fight against. Dr. Maté's teachings have given me a new framework for understanding my mental health. Instead of seeing my bipolar disorder as a lifelong burden, I now see it as a reflection of the trauma I've experienced and as an invitation to heal. It's not about curing myself or erasing the highs and lows. It's about learning to navigate them with compassion, understanding, and a commitment to self-care. Page 6, Affirmation. My journey of healing begins with understanding. Chapter 8, Breaking the Cycle of Shame. Page 1. Shame has been a constant companion in my journey with bipolar disorder. It's an emotion I've carried with me for as long as I can remember, even before I had a name for what I was experiencing. I always felt like there was something wrong with me, something fundamentally flawed that made me different from everyone else. For years, I tried to hide my mood swings, my emotions, my struggles, anything that might make people see the parts of me I didn't want to acknowledge. I became a master at putting on a facade, pretending that everything was okay, even when I was crumbling inside. But the more I hid, the more the shame grew. Dr. Gabor Maté talks about how shame is often a byproduct of trauma. When we experience emotional pain, especially as children, we internalize the belief that there's something wrong with us, that we're unworthy, unlovable, or broken. This belief becomes a part of us, shaping how we see ourselves and how we interact with the world. For me, this internalized shame was like a heavy weight that I carried everywhere I went. It colored everything I did, every relationship I had, every decision I made. It was always there, whispering that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't deserve love or happiness, that I was too much for people to handle. Page 2. Shame is a powerful force, and it can keep us trapped in cycles of self-blame and self-criticism. I spent years feeling ashamed of my bipolar disorder, ashamed of the way my emotions seemed to take over my life. I thought that if I could just be normal, if I could just keep everything under control, the shame would go away. But it didn't. No matter how hard I tried to hide or manage my symptoms, the shame was always there, lurking in the background. One of the most liberating things I learned from Dr. Maté is that shame is not something we're born with. It's something we learn. And because it's learned, it can be unlearned. This was a revelation to me. For so long, I thought shame was just a part of who I was, something I would have to live with forever. But Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that shame was a response to the trauma I had experienced, not a reflection of my true self. He talks about how trauma can make us feel unworthy, not because we are, but because we've internalized the message that we're not good enough. Whether it's through emotional neglect, criticism, or abandonment, we come to believe that we're at fault for the pain we've experienced. And that belief becomes the foundation for shame. Page 3. As I began to explore the roots of my shame, I realized that much of it stemmed from my childhood. I grew up in an environment where emotions were seen as a weakness, where vulnerability was discouraged, and where I often felt like I had to be perfect to be loved. These early experiences shaped how I saw myself and how I related to my emotions. I learned to hide my feelings, to put on a brave face, and to push through, even when I was hurting inside. But that constant effort to hide my emotions only deepened my shame. I started to believe that my emotions were wrong, that they made me weak or defective. And as my bipolar symptoms became more pronounced, the shame grew even stronger. I felt like I was failing to be normal, failing to control my emotions, failing to live up to the expectations I had set for myself. But here's the thing: shame thrives in secrecy. The more we hide, the stronger it becomes. And that's exactly what I had been doing for years, hiding my true self, hiding my struggles, hiding my emotions. But Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that the only way to break the cycle of shame was to bring those hidden parts of myself into the light. Page 4. Breaking the cycle of shame wasn't easy. It meant confronting the beliefs I had carried for so long, the belief that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't deserve love, that my emotions were a burden. It meant allowing myself to be vulnerable, to admit that I was struggling, and to let go of the need to be perfect. One of the most powerful things Dr. Maté teaches is the importance of self-compassion. He says that in order to heal, we have to learn to be kind to ourselves, especially in our moments of pain and vulnerability. This was a foreign concept to me. I had spent so much of my life being hard on myself, criticizing myself for not being better, stronger, or more in control. But as I began to practice self-compassion, I started to see myself in a different light. I realized that my emotions weren't something to be ashamed of. They were a natural response to the pain I had experienced. My mood swings weren't a sign of weakness. They were my body's way of coping with unresolved trauma. And the more I allowed myself to feel without judgment, the more I began to release the shame I had been carrying. Page 5. It was a slow process, and there were times when the shame would resurface, stronger than ever. But with each step, I became more aware of the patterns that had been holding me back. I started to recognize when I was falling into the trap of self-blame, and I learned to challenge those thoughts with compassion and understanding. Breaking the cycle of shame wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that the pain never happened. It was about learning to accept myself as I am, with all my flaws and imperfections. It was about embracing the parts of me that I had tried to hide for so long and recognizing that those parts were worthy of love and acceptance too. Dr. Maté's teachings gave me the tools to start breaking free from the shame that had kept me trapped for so long. And while I'm still on that journey, I'm no longer defined by my shame. I'm learning to see myself with kindness, to accept my emotions without judgment, and to let go of the belief that I have to be perfect in order to be worthy. Page 6, Affirmation. I release shame and embrace the truth of my worth. Chapter 9, Accepting My True Self. Page 1. For most of my life, I've struggled with the question of identity. Who am I really? Am I the person I present to the world, the one who seems put together and in control? Or am I the person I hide, the one who struggles with mood swings, who feels lost and overwhelmed? I spent years trying to figure out who the real me was, convinced that if I could just find that answer, everything would fall into place. But the truth is, my identity isn't something that can be neatly packaged or defined. It's messy, complex, and ever-evolving, and that's okay. One of the most profound lessons I learned from Dr. Gabor Maté is that healing comes from accepting all parts of ourselves, the light and the dark, the strong and the vulnerable, the parts we love and the parts we struggle with. It's about embracing our wholeness, even when that wholeness doesn't fit into society's neat little boxes. I had always believed that in order to be loved and accepted, I had to present a certain version of myself, the version that was normal, in control, and emotionally stable. But Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that true healing, true acceptance, comes when we stop trying to fit into other people's expectations and start embracing who we really are. Page 2. For me, this journey of self-acceptance has been about letting go of the need to be perfect. I used to think that in order to be loved, I had to have it all together. I had to be successful, emotionally stable, and in control of my life. But that belief only led to more pain, more shame, and more self-criticism. Dr. Maté talks about how our true selves are often buried beneath layers of conditioning, expectations, and trauma. As children, we learn to adapt to the world around us in order to survive. We take on roles, behaviors, and beliefs that help us fit in, but in doing so, we often lose touch with our authentic selves. I realized that much of my life had been spent trying to be someone I wasn't, someone who didn't feel things so deeply, who wasn't so sensitive, who could keep her emotions in check. But the more I tried to be that person, the more disconnected I felt from myself. I was constantly at war with my emotions, trying to suppress the parts of me that I thought weren't good enough. Page 3. One of the biggest turning points for me was when I stopped trying to fix myself and started embracing all parts of who I am. I began to see that my sensitivity, my emotional depth, and even my mood swings were not flaws. They were part of what made me who I am. They were part of my true self. Dr. Maté talks about how healing is not about changing who we are. It's about coming home to who we've always been. It's about peeling back the layers of conditioning and trauma to reveal the authentic self that has been there all along. For me, this meant accepting that I'm not always going to be emotionally stable, and that's okay. It meant acknowledging that I feel things deeply, that I'm sensitive, and that I'm affected by the world around me. But instead of seeing those traits as weaknesses, I started to see them as strengths. My emotional depth allows me to connect with others in meaningful ways. My sensitivity makes me attuned to the needs of those around me. And my vulnerability allows me to build authentic, genuine relationships. Page 4. Accepting my true self wasn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. There are still days when I struggle with self-acceptance, when I feel the urge to hide parts of myself or pretend to be something I'm not. But Dr. Maté's teachings remind me that healing is a journey, not a destination. It's about showing up for ourselves every day with compassion and acceptance. I've learned that self-acceptance doesn't mean we have to love every part of ourselves all the time. It's okay to have moments of doubt, moments when we wish we could change certain things about ourselves. But what's important is that we don't let those moments define us. We can hold space for both the parts of ourselves we love and the parts we struggle with, without judgment. As I continue on this journey of self-acceptance, I'm learning to be kinder to myself. I'm learning to embrace the messy, imperfect, and complex person that I am, and to recognize that my worth isn't tied to how well I fit into society's expectations. My worth comes from being true to myself, from honoring my emotions, and from accepting that I am enough, just as I am. Page 5. Dr. Maté often says that healing is about reconnecting with our true selves, the self that was there before trauma, before conditioning, before we learned to hide parts of who we are. And for me, that has been the most liberating part of this journey, reconnecting with the parts of myself that I had buried for so long. I no longer see my bipolar disorder as something that makes me less worthy or less lovable. I no longer feel the need to hide my emotions or pretend to be something I'm not. Instead, I'm learning to embrace all of who I am, the highs and the lows, the light and the dark, and to trust that I am enough, just as I am. Page 6, affirmation. I am worthy of love and acceptance exactly as I am. Chapter 10, the role of compassion in healing. Page 1, compassion, both for myself and for others, has been one of the most transformative aspects of my healing journey. For years, I was incredibly hard on myself, constantly criticizing my emotions, my reactions, and my inability to control my bipolar disorder. I believed that if I could just be stronger, more disciplined, more normal, then I wouldn't have to deal with the chaos inside me. But that mindset only fueled my pain and deepened my shame. Dr. Gabor Maté teaches that healing requires compassion, true, deep compassion for ourselves and the parts of us that are hurting. This was a difficult lesson for me to learn. I had spent so much of my life believing that I needed to be tough, that I had to push through my struggles and not let my emotions get the best of me. But the more I tried to be tough, the more disconnected I felt from myself. I wasn't giving myself the compassion I needed to heal. The turning point came when I began to realize that the same compassion I had for others was something I deserved to extend to myself. I had always been able to offer kindness and understanding to friends who were struggling. But when it came to my own pain, I was harsh and judgmental. Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that this lack of self-compassion was one of the biggest barriers to my healing. Page 2. Compassion, as Dr. Maté explains it, isn't about excusing or ignoring the challenges we face. It's about acknowledging our pain, our struggles, and our mistakes with kindness rather than judgment. It's about recognizing that we are all doing the best we can with the tools we have, and that sometimes those tools aren't enough to keep us from hurting. For me, learning to practice self-compassion meant letting go of the belief that I needed to fix myself. I had spent years trying to fix my bipolar disorder, trying to control my emotions and force myself to be more stable. But Dr. Maté's teachings made me realize that healing doesn't come from control. It comes from understanding and accepting ourselves as we are. This shift in mindset was life-changing. Instead of viewing my mood swings as failures or weaknesses, I started to see them as part of my human experience. I began to ask myself, what do I need right now, rather than what's wrong with me? And with that simple shift, I started to approach my emotions with more compassion and less judgment. Page 3. One of the most powerful aspects of Dr. Maté's work is his emphasis on compassion for the parts of ourselves that are hurting. He talks about how trauma often leaves us with emotional wounds that we carry for years, sometimes without even realizing it. These wounds show up in our thoughts, behaviors, and emotions, and they can make us feel like we're broken or flawed. But instead of seeing those wounds as something to be ashamed of, Dr. Maté encourages us to approach them with compassion. He teaches that our wounds are a natural response to pain and that they are not a reflection of our worth. This was a revelation for me. For so long, I had seen my emotional instability as a personal failing, something that made me less worthy or less lovable. But when I started to view my mood swings through the lens of compassion, everything changed. I began to see my emotional highs and lows not as something to be fixed, but as signals from my body and mind that something deeper needed attention. Instead of fighting against my emotions, I started to listen to them with kindness and curiosity. I asked myself, what is this feeling trying to tell me? And the more I listened, the more I understood that my emotions weren't the problem. They were the key to my healing. Page 4. Compassion also played a crucial role in how I began to interact with others. Dr. Maté talks about how trauma can disconnect us from the people around us, making it difficult to trust others or to feel safe in relationships. I had experienced this firsthand. My bipolar disorder often made it hard for me to maintain stable relationships, and I found myself withdrawing from the people I cared about when I felt overwhelmed by my emotions. But as I began to practice self-compassion, I also learned to extend that compassion to others. I realized that just as I had been carrying my own wounds, the people around me were also carrying theirs. Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that we are all struggling in our own ways, and that kindness and understanding are essential in healing, not just ourselves, but our relationships. As I embraced this mindset, my relationships started to change. I became more patient with the people in my life, more willing to listen, and less likely to judge. I began to approach others with the same compassion I was learning to offer myself, and in doing so, I found that my connections with others deepened. I no longer felt the need to hide my emotions or pretend that everything was okay. Instead, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to share my struggles openly, and to trust that the people who truly cared about me would accept me as I am. Page 5. Learning to practice compassion both for myself and for others has been one of the most transformative parts of my healing journey. It hasn't always been easy. There are still days when I fall back into old patterns of self-criticism, when I feel the urge to hide my emotions or push through the pain. But now I have the tools to bring myself back to a place of kindness and understanding. Dr. Maté often says that healing requires us to be gentle with ourselves, to approach our pain with compassion rather than judgment. And that's what I'm learning to do. I'm learning to be kind to myself, even when I'm struggling. I'm learning to listen to my emotions without trying to control or suppress them. And I'm learning to trust that compassion is not a weakness, but a strength, one that allows me to heal, to grow, and to connect more deeply with the world around me. Page 6, affirmation. I am gentle with myself on this journey, and that is enough. Chapter 11, reconnecting with the body. Page 1, for years I lived almost entirely in my head. My thoughts, my worries, my emotions, they dominated my experience of the world. My body, on the other hand, felt like a distant, disconnected part of me, something I paid little attention to, unless it was in pain or discomfort. I was so focused on managing my mental health that I rarely considered how my physical body played a role in my healing. But Dr. Gabor Maté's work introduced me to the idea that the mind and body are not separate, they are deeply interconnected. He teaches that trauma isn't just something we experience emotionally, it's something we hold in our bodies. Our muscles, our organs, our nervous system, all of these physical parts of us carry the imprints of our past pain. This concept was new to me, and at first it was hard to grasp. I had always thought of trauma as something psychological, something that lived in my mind and affected my thoughts and emotions. But the more I learned about the mind-body connection, the more I realized that my body had been carrying my trauma all along. The tension, the fatigue, the physical exhaustion I often felt during depressive episodes, they weren't just symptoms of my mental illness. They were my body's way of communicating that something was wrong. Page 2. One of the things Dr. Maté emphasizes is that when we disconnect from our bodies, we disconnect from our emotions. This was a huge revelation for me. I had always been somewhat detached from my body, seeing it as something secondary to my mind. But Dr. Maté's teachings made me realize that in order to truly heal, I needed to reconnect with my body and learn to listen to the signals it was sending me. I started to pay more attention to how my body reacted to stress, anxiety, and emotional pain. I noticed how my muscles would tense up when I was feeling anxious, how my chest would feel tight when I was sad, and how my energy would drain completely during depressive episodes. These weren't just random physical sensations. They were my body's way of processing the emotions I had been carrying. Dr. Maté often talks about how the body holds on to trauma when we don't have the tools to process it. This made sense to me. I had spent so many years suppressing my emotions, trying to push through the pain without really feeling it. And as a result, that pain had taken up residence in my body, manifesting in ways I hadn't fully understood. Page 3. As I began to reconnect with my body, I also started to explore practices that helped me release the tension and emotional energy that had been stored there. Yoga became a powerful tool for me. It wasn't just about the physical poses. It was about learning to breathe, to be present in my body, and to feel the sensations that I had been ignoring for so long. Through yoga, I learned to pay attention to the places where I held tension, the tightness in my shoulders, the clenching in my jaw, the heaviness in my chest. I began to see how these physical sensations were connected to my emotions, and how by releasing that tension, I could start to release the emotional pain that had been trapped in my body. Meditation was another practice that helped me reconnect with my body. At first, it was incredibly difficult. Sitting still, being present with my thoughts and sensations, it felt uncomfortable, even unbearable at times. But as I continued to practice, I started to notice a shift. I became more aware of how my body responded to my emotions, and I began to develop a sense of compassion for the physical pain I had been carrying. Page 4. Reconnecting with my body wasn't just about yoga or meditation. It was about learning to listen to my body in everyday life. I started to notice how my body felt in different situations, how it responded to stress, to joy, to sadness. I realized that my body had been speaking to me all along, but I hadn't been paying attention. Dr. Maté teaches that the body holds wisdom, and that if we learn to listen to it, we can gain valuable insights into our emotional and physical health. This was a completely new way of thinking for me. I had always seen my body as something separate from my mental health, something that I only needed to pay attention to when it was in pain or discomfort. But as I started to listen more closely, I began to understand that my body was an integral part of my healing. I started to honor my body's needs in a way I hadn't before. I rested when I needed rest, moved when I needed movement, and nourished myself with food that made me feel good. I began to see my body as a partner in my healing journey rather than something to be ignored or pushed through. Page 5. Reconnecting with my body has been one of the most profound parts of my healing journey. It has allowed me to tap into a deeper understanding of myself, one that goes beyond my thoughts and emotions. I've learned that my body holds memories, emotions, and wisdom, and that by listening to it, I can gain a deeper sense of peace and balance. Dr. Maté often says that healing is not just about the mind, it's about the whole person, body, and soul. And that's what I'm learning to embrace. My body is not separate from my healing. It is an essential part of it. By reconnecting with my body, I'm learning to release the trauma I've been carrying, to honor my physical and emotional needs, and to trust that my body has the capacity to heal. Page 6, Affirmation. I trust my body to guide me toward peace. Chapter 12, Moving from Survival to Living. Page 1. For so long, I felt like I was just surviving. Each day was about getting through the mood swings, managing my emotions, and trying to keep everything together. I was always in survival mode, bracing myself for the next manic episode or the next depressive crash. It felt like my entire life was focused on managing the ups and downs of my bipolar disorder, and there wasn't much room for anything else. But through Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings, I began to realize that there was a difference between surviving and truly living. Surviving was about getting by, about doing whatever I could to avoid pain and keep functioning. Living, on the other hand, was about embracing life fully, about being present, about feeling joy, about connecting with myself and the world around me in a meaningful way. For years, I had been stuck in survival mode. My main focus was on managing my mental health, on avoiding the extremes of my mood swings, and on keeping myself afloat. But the more I learned about trauma and healing, the more I realized that I didn't want to just survive, I wanted to live. Page 2. Dr. Maté talks about how trauma can keep us in a state of constant survival. When we've experienced pain or emotional neglect, our nervous system goes into overdrive, always on high alert, always bracing for the next threat. This was exactly how I had been living, always preparing for the next emotional crisis, always trying to stay one step ahead of the chaos. But as I began to heal, I realized that I didn't want to live that way anymore. I didn't want my life to be defined by fear, by anxiety, or by the constant need to manage my emotions. I wanted to move beyond survival mode and start truly living. The shift from surviving to living wasn't an overnight transformation. It was a gradual process, one that required me to let go of the belief that my life was always going to be a struggle. I had to start believing that I was capable of more, that I deserved more than just getting by. Page 3. One of the first steps in this process was learning to slow down. When you're in survival mode, everything feels urgent. There's a constant sense of pressure, a need to keep moving, to stay busy in order to avoid the discomfort of sitting with your emotions. But in order to start living fully, I had to learn to slow down, to be present with myself, and to allow myself to experience life without the constant rush. Dr. Maté teaches that healing requires us to step out of the survival mindset and into a place of presence and connection. This was a challenge for me at first. I had spent so many years in survival mode that it felt unnatural to slow down, to be still, and to just be. But the more I practiced being present, the more I realized how much of life I had been missing out on. I began to notice the small moments of joy that I had overlooked before. The warmth of the sun on my skin, the sound of birds chirping outside my window, the feeling of peace that came from simply sitting in silence. These moments may have seemed insignificant before, but they were actually the moments that made life feel rich and meaningful. Page 4. Another important part of moving from survival to living was learning to prioritize my well-being. When I was in survival mode, I often neglected my own needs. I would push myself to the point of exhaustion, ignoring the signals my body was giving me, and convincing myself that I had to keep going, no matter what. But as I started to focus on living fully, I realized that taking care of myself was essential. I began to prioritize rest, relaxation, and self-care in a way I hadn't before. I gave myself permission to slow down when I needed to take breaks, and to listen to my body's needs. And in doing so, I started to feel more alive, more connected to myself, and more present in my daily life. Dr. Maté often says that healing isn't about achieving some perfect state of well-being. It's about learning to live fully in the present moment with all of its ups and downs. This was a powerful lesson for me. I realized that living fully didn't mean I would never have mood swings or emotional challenges. It meant that I could experience those challenges without being consumed by them. Page 5. Moving from survival to living has been a gradual process, and I'm still on that journey. There are days when I slip back into survival mode, when I feel overwhelmed by my emotions and the urge to retreat. But now, I have the tools to bring myself back to a place of presence and connection. I'm learning that living fully is about embracing the whole spectrum of life, the joy and the pain, the highs and the lows, the moments of peace and the moments of struggle. It's about being present with myself and with the world around me without needing to control or fix everything. Through Dr. Maté's teachings, I've come to understand that life is not about avoiding pain or discomfort. It's about being open to the full range of human experience. And that's what I'm learning to do. I'm learning to live, not just survive. I'm learning to embrace the beauty of life, even in the midst of challenges. And in doing so, I'm discovering a sense of peace and fulfillment that I didn't think was possible. Page 6. Affirmation. I am not just surviving, I am learning to live fully. Chapter 13. Understanding the Roots of Addiction. Page 1. Before I began exploring Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings, I didn't think addiction had much to do with my life. I wasn't addicted to drugs or alcohol, and I didn't think I had any other harmful habits that would classify as an addiction. But the more I listened to Dr. Maté talk about the true nature of addiction, the more I realized how much of my life had been shaped by addictive behaviors. Dr. Mate describes addiction as any behavior that we use to numb our pain, escape uncomfortable emotions, or avoid facing something inside ourselves. It's not just about substances. It can be anything we turn to in order to distract ourselves from the discomfort we don't want to feel. This could be food, work, relationships, technology, or even our thoughts. As I reflected on this broader definition of addiction, I realized that I had been engaging in addictive behaviors for most of my life. I wasn't using substances to escape, but I was definitely using other things, like overworking, overthinking, and emotional withdrawal, to avoid facing my pain. In many ways, my coping mechanisms had become my own form of addiction. Page 2. Dr. Maté explains that addiction is often rooted in trauma. When we experience emotional pain, particularly in childhood, we learn to numb ourselves in order to survive. The behaviors that start as coping mechanisms, like zoning out in front of the TV, obsessing over work, or avoiding difficult conversations, can easily turn into addictions when we rely on them too much. This idea hit home for me. I started to see how my childhood experiences, especially the emotional neglect and fear of vulnerability, had shaped my coping strategies. I had learned early on to avoid difficult emotions, to bury my pain, and to distract myself with anything that kept me feeling the depth of my sadness, anger, or fear. And while these strategies helped me survive, they also kept me stuck in a cycle of avoidance. My manic episodes were often fueled by this need to escape. When I felt the pressure of unresolved emotions building up, I would throw myself into work or projects, staying up all night, chasing an endless stream of ideas, and avoiding any real emotional reflection. It was exhilarating at times, but it was also a way to numb myself, to avoid sitting with the pain that was lurking beneath the surface. Page 3. On the other side of the spectrum, my depressive episodes were moments when I could no longer escape the emotions I had been avoiding. During these times, the emotional numbness I had sought through my addictive behaviors would catch up with me, and I would feel overwhelmed by the weight of everything I had been trying to suppress. Dr. Maté talks about how addiction in any form is never the problem itself. It's a response to the deeper problem of unresolved trauma and emotional pain. This was a huge revelation for me. I realized that my addictive behaviors, the need to stay busy, to distract myself with work, to avoid vulnerability in relationships, were all ways of trying to manage the pain I didn't know how to deal with. It wasn't about the behaviors themselves. It was about the emotions and trauma I was trying to avoid. My addiction wasn't work or overthinking or emotional withdrawal. My addiction was to avoiding pain, and that avoidance had shaped so much of my life. Page 4. Understanding the roots of addiction through this lens allowed me to start approaching my behaviors with more compassion. Instead of judging myself for the ways I had coped, I began to see those behaviors as survival mechanisms. They weren't healthy, but they had helped me get through difficult times when I didn't have the tools or support to process my emotions in a healthier way. Dr. Maté emphasizes that in order to heal from addiction, we have to go to the root of the pain. We have to address the trauma that is driving the addictive behaviors, rather than just trying to manage or control the behaviors themselves. This resonated deeply with me because I had spent so much time trying to control my bipolar disorder by focusing on the external symptoms, the manic highs, the depressive lows, without addressing the underlying emotional pain that was fueling those extremes. When I started to focus on healing the pain rather than controlling the behaviors, I noticed a shift. My need to overwork, to distract myself, to avoid emotions began to lessen. I was no longer relying on those behaviors to numb myself because I was starting to face the pain I had been running from for so long. Page 5. Healing from addiction isn't about willpower or discipline. It's about healing the emotional wounds that are driving the addictive behaviors. This is what Dr. Maté teaches, and it's what I've experienced in my own life. As I've worked through my trauma, my need to numb myself has diminished. I still have moments when I fall back into old patterns, but now I have the awareness and the tools to recognize when I'm using those behaviors to avoid pain. I've learned that addiction, in whatever form it takes, is a signal that something deeper needs attention. It's a message from the body and mind that we are in pain, that we need healing, that we need to feel what we've been avoiding. And once we start listening to that message, we can begin to heal. Through Dr. Maté's teachings, I've come to understand that healing from addiction isn't about fixing the behaviors, it's about addressing the pain. It's about learning to sit with our emotions, to feel the discomfort, and to trust that we have the capacity to heal without needing to numb ourselves. And that's what I'm learning to do every day. Page 6, affirmation. I am healing the root causes of my pain. Chapter 14, the role of community in healing. One of the most surprising things I've learned on this journey is how essential community is to the healing process. For years, I believed that healing was something I had to do alone. I thought that my pain, my struggles, and my bipolar disorder were personal battles that I needed to face on my own. But Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings have shown me that true healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in connection with others. Dr. Maté often talks about how trauma disconnects us from ourselves and from the people around us. When we experience emotional pain, especially in childhood, we often feel abandoned, neglected, or rejected. This creates a sense of isolation, a belief that we are on our own in the world. And that belief can carry into adulthood, making it difficult to trust others, to feel safe in relationships, or to ask for help when we need it. This was something I had experienced for most of my life. I was always the strong one, the one who didn't need help, the one who could handle everything on my own. But the truth was, I felt deeply alone. I struggled with my emotions in silence, convinced that no one would understand or that asking for help would make me appear weak. Page 2. But as I began to explore Dr. Maté's work, I realized that healing isn't something we can or should do alone. He talks about how connection is a fundamental human need, and that in order to heal, we need to feel seen, heard, and supported by others. This was a radical shift for me. I had spent so much time trying to manage my bipolar disorder on my own, believing that if I just worked hard enough, I could figure it all out by myself. But the more I isolated myself, the harder things became. Without the support of others, my emotions felt heavier, my struggles felt more overwhelming, and my sense of loneliness deepened. I started to realize that the isolation wasn't helping. It was actually making things worse. Dr. Maté's teachings encouraged me to start reaching out for support, even though it felt uncomfortable at first. I began to open up to friends and family about my struggles, sharing parts of myself that I had always kept hidden. It wasn't easy. I had built up so many walls to protect myself from being vulnerable. But the more I let people in, the more I realized how healing it was to feel connected to others. Page 3. One of the most powerful experiences I had was when I joined a support group for people with bipolar disorder. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't want to be vulnerable in front of strangers, and I wasn't sure if anyone would really understand what I was going through. But when I walked into that room for the first time and heard others share their stories, something shifted inside me. I realized that I wasn't alone. The stories I heard mirrored my own experiences in ways I hadn't expected. I heard people talk about their struggles with mood swings, their battles with shame, their fear of rejection, and it was like they were speaking directly to me. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I felt understood, and that feeling of connection was incredibly healing. Dr. Mate talks about how community can help us heal by providing a space where we feel safe, supported, and accepted for who we are. This was exactly what I experienced in the support group. The people in that room didn't judge me for my emotions or my struggles. They didn't expect me to be better or fixed. They accepted me as I was, and that acceptance allowed me to start accepting myself. Page 4. As I continued to connect with others, both in the support group and in my personal life, I began to notice how much lighter my emotional load felt. The shame and isolation that had weighed me down for so long started to lift. I realized that by sharing my story, by being vulnerable, I was not only helping myself, I was also helping others. Dr. Mate teaches that healing is a collective process. When we share our pain, our struggles, and our experiences with others, we create a space where healing can happen for everyone involved. This has been one of the most profound lessons I've learned. By opening up and allowing myself to be vulnerable, I've created deeper, more meaningful connections with the people in my life. And those connections have been a vital part of my healing journey. It's not that the pain or the challenges disappear when we're in community, but having the support of others makes it easier to navigate those challenges. Knowing that I'm not alone, that there are people who understand and who are willing to walk this path with me, has given me the strength to keep going, even on the hardest days. Page 5. Through Dr. Mate's teachings, I've come to see that healing isn't just about what happens inside of us. It's also about the connections we make with others. We heal through relationships, through community, through being seen and understood. And for someone like me who spent so many years feeling isolated and alone, that has been one of the most important lessons of all. I'm still learning how to lean on others, how to ask for help when I need it, and how to trust that I don't have to carry everything on my own. But I'm no longer afraid of being vulnerable. I've seen the power of connection, and I know now that healing isn't something we do in isolation. It's something we do together. Page 6, Affirmation. I am connected to others. We heal together. Chapter 15, The Power of Presence. Page 1. One of the most transformative lessons I've learned from Dr. Gabor Maté is the importance of presence. In a world where we are constantly distracted by our thoughts, our emotions, our devices, and the demands of everyday life, learning to be present feels almost revolutionary. For someone like me, who has spent so much time caught up in the highs and lows of bipolar disorder, being present seemed like an impossible task. My mind was always racing, always focused on the past or the future, rarely grounded in the here and now. Dr. Maté talks about how presence is essential for healing. He teaches that we cannot truly heal if we are not fully in touch with ourselves, our emotions, and our bodies in the present moment. This made sense to me on an intellectual level, but putting it into practice was a completely different story. My mind had been conditioned to constantly anticipate the next mood swing, to brace for the next crisis, or to dwell on the emotional fallout of my past. Being present, that felt elusive, like something I couldn't quite grasp. But I realized that in order to heal, I needed to stop running from the present moment. I had to learn how to sit with whatever was happening, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. And that was a huge shift for me. Page 2. For most of my life, I had avoided being present. The mania, the depression, the anxiety, it all felt too overwhelming to handle. So I distracted myself. I threw myself into work, into relationships, into anything that could take my mind off the emotions I didn't want to face. But that avoidance only deepened my pain. Dr. Mate's teachings helped me see that healing couldn't happen while I was running from myself. I had to stop and face whatever was happening, right here, right now. The first step in learning to be present was mindfulness. I started practicing mindfulness meditation, something that at first seemed impossible. Sitting still with my thoughts felt like torture. My mind was always racing, always trying to pull me into the future or drag me back into the past. But the more I practiced, the more I began to understand that presence isn't about controlling your thoughts. It's about being aware of them without getting swept away. Mindfulness taught me how to observe my thoughts and emotions without reacting to them. Instead of getting caught up in the stories my mind was telling me, I started to notice them with a sense of curiosity. Oh, there's that anxious thought again. Here comes the sadness. I didn't try to push them away or change them. I just let them be, and in doing so, I started to feel more grounded in the present moment. Page 3. Being present wasn't just about mindfulness meditation. It was about learning to be fully engaged in my everyday life. I started to pay attention to the simple things I had overlooked for so long: the feel of my breath moving in and out of my body, the sensation of the ground beneath my feet, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. These small moments of presence became anchors for me, helping to pull me back to the here and now when my mind wanted to spiral into worry or self-doubt. Dr. Maté talks about how presence is the key to emotional healing because it allows us to fully feel and process our emotions. When we are present, we are no longer running from our feelings. We are meeting them head-on, with curiosity and compassion. This was a difficult lesson for me. For so long, I had been trying to avoid my emotions, to distract myself from the discomfort they caused. But presence taught me that the only way out of the pain was through it. As I practiced being present, I began to notice a shift in how I related to my emotions. Instead of being overwhelmed by them, I started to see them as temporary experiences, waves that would rise and fall. And the more present I became, the more I realized that I could ride those waves without being pulled under. Page 4. Being present also helped me navigate the extremes of my bipolar disorder. When I felt a manic episode coming on, I would ground myself in the present moment, paying attention to the physical sensations in my body and the thoughts racing through my mind. I didn't try to stop the mania from happening, but I did use presence to stay connected to myself, to stay aware of what was happening. And in doing so, I found that the manic energy didn't feel as out of control as it had in the past. The same was true for my depressive episodes. When the heaviness set in, I would remind myself to stay present with what I was feeling. I would focus on the sensations in my body, the heaviness in my limbs, the tightness in my chest, and instead of resisting them, I would allow myself to fully feel them. It wasn't easy, and it didn't make the depression go away, but it did help me stay connected to myself in a way that felt healing. Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that presence is not about escaping our emotions. It's about fully experiencing them. It's about being with ourselves, even in the midst of pain, and trusting that we have the capacity to hold whatever emotions arise. Page 5. Learning to be present has changed the way I relate to myself and the world around me. I no longer feel like I have to run from my emotions or distract myself from the discomfort. Instead, I've learned to sit with whatever is happening, trusting that I can handle it. And in doing so, I've found a sense of peace that I didn't think was possible. Presence has become my anchor. When I feel overwhelmed by my emotions, when my mind starts racing, or when the highs and lows of bipolar disorder feel too much to handle, I return to the present moment. I ground myself in my body, in my breath, in the sensations of the world around me. And in that space of presence, I find clarity, peace, and healing. Dr. Maté's teachings have shown me that healing isn't about escaping our emotions or controlling our minds. It's about being present with ourselves, with compassion and awareness. And that's what I'm learning to do, one moment at a time. Page 6, affirmation, I am present in my body, mind, and emotions. Chapter 16, releasing the past. Page 1. Releasing the past has been one of the most challenging parts of my healing journey. For so long, I was held captive by the memories of my past, by the trauma I had experienced, by the pain I hadn't processed, by the emotions I had suppressed. I carried those memories with me like a heavy burden, replaying them over and over in my mind, convinced that I couldn't move forward until I had somehow fixed what had happened. But Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings helped me see that healing isn't about fixing the past, it's about releasing it. He talks about how trauma binds us to the past, keeping us stuck in cycles of pain and emotional distress. And the only way to break free from those cycles is to let go of the past, to release the hold it has on us, and to create space for new possibilities in the present. This was a difficult concept for me to grasp. I had spent so much time trying to understand my past, trying to figure out why things had happened the way they did, and trying to make sense of the emotional wounds I carried. But the more I focused on the past, the more I felt trapped by it. I realized that I wasn't going to find healing by constantly looking backward. I needed to start looking forward. Page 2. Releasing the past didn't mean forgetting what had happened or pretending that the pain didn't exist. It meant acknowledging the pain, honoring the experiences that had shaped me, and then choosing to let go of the grip those experiences had on my life. It meant releasing the need for things to have been different, releasing the desire for justice or closure, and accepting that the past was what it was. Dr. Maté talks about how trauma is not just the event itself, it's the emotional imprint that the event leaves on us. When we don't process that emotional imprint, it stays with us, influencing our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors long after the event has passed. This was exactly what I had experienced. The events of my past had long since ended, but the emotional wounds they left behind were still affecting me every day. Learning to release the past required me to go deep within myself and confront the emotions I had been holding on to for years. It meant allowing myself to grieve the losses I had experienced, to feel the anger, the sadness, and the hurt that I had suppressed for so long. And as I allowed myself to feel those emotions fully, I began to release their hold on me. Page 3. One of the most powerful tools I found in releasing the past was forgiveness. Not just forgiveness of others, but forgiveness of myself. For so long, I had blamed myself for the pain I had experienced. I believed that I was at fault, that if I had been different, stronger, more resilient, less emotional, then maybe things would have turned out differently. But Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that the pain I experienced wasn't my fault. It was the result of circumstances beyond my control, and blaming myself wasn't going to change what had happened. Forgiving myself was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It required me to let go of the shame, the guilt, and the self-blame that I had carried for so long. It required me to accept that I had done the best I could with the tools I had at the time, and that I didn't need to hold on to the pain any longer. Dr. Maté talks about how forgiveness is not about condoning what happened or letting others off the hook. It's about freeing ourselves from the emotional chains that keep us tied to the past. This was a revelation for me. I realized that holding on to anger and resentment wasn't hurting anyone but myself. By choosing to forgive, I was choosing to release the emotional burden I had been carrying, and in doing so, I was creating space for healing. Page 4. Releasing the past also meant letting go of the stories I had been telling myself about who I was and what I deserved. For years, I had internalized the belief that I wasn't worthy of love or happiness, that I was destined to live a life of struggle and emotional pain. These stories had become so ingrained in my mind that I didn't even realize they were shaping how I saw myself and the world. But through Dr. Maté's teachings, I learned that those stories were just that, stories. They weren't the truth of who I was. They were the result of trauma, of emotional wounds that hadn't been healed. And once I started to challenge those stories, once I started to release the beliefs that were holding me back, I began to see myself in a new light. I realized that I wasn't defined by my past or by the pain I had experienced. I was capable of healing, of growth, of creating a new story for myself, one that was rooted in self-compassion, in resilience, and in the belief that I was worthy of love and happiness. Page 5. Releasing the past has been one of the most freeing experiences of my life. It hasn't been easy, and there are still moments when the old stories resurface, when the memories of the past come flooding back. But now I have the tools to release those emotions, to acknowledge them, and to let them go. Dr. Maté often says that healing is not about erasing the past. It's about integrating it. It's about learning from our experiences, honoring the pain we've been through, and then releasing the hold that pain has on us. And that's what I'm learning to do. I'm learning to release the past, to free myself from the emotional chains that have kept me stuck, and to move forward into a future filled with possibility and hope. Page 6. Affirmation. I let go of the past and embrace the present. Chapter 17. Healing through vulnerability. Page 1. Vulnerability is a word that used to make me uncomfortable. For most of my life, I equated vulnerability with weakness, with being exposed in ways that made me feel unsafe. I thought that if I let people see the parts of me that were hurting, the parts of me that felt broken, I would be rejected or judged. So I built walls around myself, walls that kept my emotions hidden and my struggles private. I convinced myself that I had to be strong, that I couldn't let anyone see the messy, painful parts of my life. But as I began to dive deeper into Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings, I started to understand that true healing requires vulnerability. He talks about how trauma often leads us to disconnect from ourselves and from others, creating barriers that keep us isolated and in pain. And the only way to break down those barriers is to allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to open up and let others see us in our most authentic, imperfect, and human form. This realization was both terrifying and liberating. I had spent so many years trying to be strong, to hide my pain and keep it all together. But what I learned from Dr. Maté is that vulnerability isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of courage. It takes immense strength to be vulnerable, to let people see the parts of ourselves that we've been taught to hide. Page 2 for me, the journey toward vulnerability began with acknowledging my own pain. I had spent so much time running from my emotions, avoiding the feelings that felt too heavy to carry. But as I started to confront my trauma and work through the emotional wounds I had been carrying for years, I realized that I couldn't heal in isolation. I needed to be able to share my pain, to talk about it, and to let others in. At first, this felt incredibly risky. Vulnerability meant letting go of control, and for someone who had spent years trying to manage and control my emotions, that was a difficult shift to make. But Dr. Maté's words reminded me that healing requires connection, and connection can only happen when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. I started small. I began by opening up to a few close friends, sharing the parts of my story that I had kept hidden for so long. I talked about my bipolar disorder, my mood swings, my struggles with shame and self-blame. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to retreat, when the fear of being judged or misunderstood felt overwhelming. But as I continued to share, I began to realize something powerful. The more vulnerable I allowed myself to be, the more connected I felt to the people around me. Page 3. Dr. Maté teaches that vulnerability is the key to authentic connection. When we hide our pain, our struggles, and our emotions, we create distance between ourselves and others. We might think we're protecting ourselves, but in reality, we're keeping ourselves isolated. And isolation is the opposite of what we need when we're trying to heal. The more I allowed myself to be vulnerable, the more I started to experience the healing power of connection. I found that when I shared my story, the people in my life didn't judge me or push me away. Instead, they responded with empathy, with compassion, and with understanding. They didn't see me as weak, they saw me as human. And that made all the difference. In sharing my pain, I also found that I was helping others. The more open I was about my struggles, the more I heard from people who had been going through similar experiences. They too had been hiding their emotions, afraid of being judged or rejected. But when they saw me being vulnerable, it gave them permission to do the same. And in that shared vulnerability, we found a sense of connection that was deeply healing. Page 4. One of the most important lessons I learned from Dr. Maté is that vulnerability is not just about sharing our pain with others. It's also about being honest with ourselves. For years, I had avoided facing my own emotions. I didn't want to admit that I was hurting, that I was scared, or that I felt lost. But as I began to practice vulnerability, I realized that healing starts with being honest about where we are and what we're feeling. I started journaling as a way to explore my emotions more deeply. Writing gave me a safe space to be vulnerable with myself, to express the feelings I had been avoiding for so long. I wrote about my fears, my insecurities, my hopes, and my pain. And in doing so, I began to understand myself in a way I hadn't before. Dr. Maté often talks about how healing requires us to sit with our discomfort, to be present with our emotions rather than trying to push them away. This is where vulnerability comes in. When we allow ourselves to feel our emotions fully, without judgment, without trying to fix them, we create the space for healing. We give ourselves permission to be exactly where we are, and in that acceptance, we find peace. Page 5. Vulnerability has been a crucial part of my healing journey. It has allowed me to break down the walls I had built around myself and to connect more deeply with the people in my life. It has taught me that strength isn't about holding everything together. It's about being brave enough to let things fall apart, to admit when we're struggling, and to ask for help when we need it. Dr. Maté's teachings have shown me that healing is not a solitary process. We heal in connection with others, and that connection requires vulnerability. By opening up, by sharing our stories, and by allowing ourselves to be seen in all of our messy, imperfect humanity, we create the conditions for true healing to take place. I'm still learning how to be vulnerable. There are times when the old fear of judgment or rejection creeps in, and I feel the urge to retreat behind my walls. But now I have the tools to recognize those patterns and to choose a different path. I remind myself that vulnerability is not a weakness, it's a strength. And in being vulnerable, I am not only healing myself, I am creating the space for others to heal as well. Page 6. Affirmation. In vulnerability, I find my strength and healing. Chapter 18. The healing power of self-love. Page 1. Self-love wasn't something that came naturally to me. For most of my life, I felt like I was at war with myself, constantly criticizing, judging, and blaming myself for not being good enough. My bipolar disorder only magnified this inner conflict. During the manic episodes, I felt invincible, like I could do anything. But once the mania faded, the self-criticism would return, and I'd spiral into shame and self-doubt. The depressive episodes were the worst. There was no compassion, only an overwhelming sense of failure, as if I was fundamentally flawed. I didn't realize how deeply ingrained my lack of self-love was until I started exploring Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings. He talks about how many of us carry a sense of unworthiness that is rooted in trauma. When we experience emotional pain, whether from neglect, abandonment, or rejection, we often internalize the belief that we are not deserving of love, care, or kindness. And that belief shapes how we treat ourselves. For me, That lack of self-love showed up in the way I spoke to myself, in the way I pushed myself to the brink of exhaustion, and in the way I never felt like I was enough. I was always striving to be better, to do more, to prove my worth. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was failing. Page 2, Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that the harshness with which I treated myself wasn't helping. It was hurting. He talks about how healing requires self-compassion, and self-compassion is rooted in self-love. This was a completely new concept for me. I had always believed that I needed to be tough on myself in order to succeed, in order to keep moving forward. But what I didn't realize was that the constant self-criticism was keeping me stuck in a cycle of shame and self-blame. The idea of self-love felt foreign, even uncomfortable at first. I didn't know how to start loving myself when I had spent so many years believing that I wasn't worthy of that love. But Dr. Maté's words kept coming back to me. You cannot heal if you do not love yourself. I realized that if I wanted to heal, I had to start by changing the way I treated myself. One of the first steps I took towards self-love was learning to speak to myself with kindness. I started paying attention to the way I talked to myself, especially during moments of struggle. I noticed how quick I was to criticize myself when things didn't go the way I had planned, how easily I blamed myself for not being better or more in control. And once I became aware of these patterns, I began to challenge them. Page 3. Instead of beating myself up when I was feeling down, I began to offer myself words of encouragement. Instead of criticizing myself for not being able to manage my emotions, I reminded myself that I was doing the best I could with the tools I had. This wasn't an easy shift to make. It felt unnatural at first. But the more I practiced speaking to myself with kindness, the more I started to notice a change. Dr. Maté talks about how self-love is not just about feeling good about ourselves. It's about accepting ourselves fully, even in our moments of pain, struggle, and imperfection. This was a powerful lesson for me. I had always thought that in order to love myself, I needed to fix the parts of me that were broken. But through Dr. Maté's teachings, I learned that self-love is about embracing all parts of ourselves, including the parts that are hurting. As I started to practice self-love, I also began to treat myself with more care. I started listening to my body's needs, allowing myself to rest when I needed to, and giving myself permission to take breaks without feeling guilty. I stopped pushing myself to the point of exhaustion, and instead, I began to prioritize my well-being. This was a radical shift for me. For so long, I had believed that my worth was tied to how much I could accomplish, how much I could push through. But self-love taught me that my worth wasn't dependent on what I did, it was inherent in who I was. Page 4. Self-love also meant letting go of the unrealistic expectations I had set for myself. I had always held myself to impossibly high standards, believing that I needed to be perfect in order to be worthy of love. But perfection is an illusion, and striving for it only set me up for disappointment and self-criticism. Through Dr. Maté's teachings, I learned that true self-love is about embracing our imperfections, about accepting that we are human, and that being human means we will sometimes make mistakes. I began to release the pressure I had been putting on myself to be perfect. I stopped measuring my worth by my productivity or my ability to keep it together. Instead, I started to value myself for who I was, not for what I did. I started to see my worth as inherent, not something that needed to be earned or proven. This was one of the most liberating parts of my journey towards self-love. Dr. Maté also emphasizes the importance of self-love in relation to our mental health. He talks about how, when we love ourselves, we create an internal environment that is conducive to healing. We become more compassionate with ourselves during times of struggle, more patient with our emotional ups and downs, and more willing to seek the help and support we need. Page 5. As I continued to practice self-love, I noticed that my relationship with my bipolar disorder began to change. Instead of seeing it as something that made me less than or broken, I started to view it as part of who I was. I began to accept that my mood swings, my emotional highs and lows were not something to be ashamed of. They were simply part of my experience. Self-love allowed me to approach my mental health with more compassion. Instead of trying to fix myself, I started to focus on caring for myself. I stopped judging myself for having bad days, and I began to see those days as opportunities to offer myself even more love and care. I started to trust that I could handle whatever emotions arose, not because I was strong, but because I was learning to love myself through it all. Dr. Maté's teachings on self-love have been a guiding force in my healing journey. They've taught me that healing isn't about reaching a place of perfection or erasing our struggles. It's about learning to love ourselves, exactly as we are, in every moment. And that love, that compassion, is the foundation for true healing. Page 6, Affirmation, I am worthy of my own love and care. Chapter 19, Embracing All Parts of Myself. One of the biggest shifts in my healing journey has been learning to embrace all parts of myself, the light and the dark, the joy and the pain, the parts I'm proud of, and the parts I've spent years trying to hide. For so long, I believed that in order to be happy, in order to be whole, I needed to get rid of the parts of myself that I didn't like. I thought that healing meant erasing my flaws, fixing my weaknesses, and becoming a better version of myself. But Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings helped me see that true healing isn't about getting rid of the parts of ourselves that we don't like. It's about embracing them. He talks about how every part of us, even the parts we struggle with, have something to teach us. Our pain, our fears, our vulnerabilities, they're all part of who we are, and they deserve to be seen and accepted, not pushed away. This was a radical shift for me. I had spent so many years trying to suppress the parts of myself that I didn't like, my sensitivity, my mood swings, my insecurities. I believed that if I could just get rid of those parts, then I would finally be okay. But the more I tried to suppress them, the stronger they became. It wasn't until I started embracing all parts of myself that I began to experience true healing. Page 2. One of the first steps in this process was learning to accept my emotions, even the ones that felt uncomfortable or overwhelming. For most of my life, I had been taught that certain emotions like anger, sadness, or fear were bad or undesirable. So I learned to hide them, to push them down and pretend that they didn't exist. But Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that all emotions are valid and that healing requires us to honor and embrace them rather than suppress them. As I began to embrace my emotions, I started to see them not as enemies, but as messengers. They were telling me something about what I needed, about what was going on inside of me. When I allowed myself to feel those emotions fully, without judgment, I started to understand them in a deeper way. I realized that my sadness wasn't something to be feared. It was a signal that I needed to slow down, to rest, to take care of myself. My anger wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was a sign that something in my life needed to change. Embracing all parts of myself also meant accepting my bipolar disorder as part of who I am. For years, I had seen my mood swings as something to be fixed or controlled. I believed that they were a sign of weakness, something that made me less worthy or less capable. But Dr. Maté's teachings helped me reframe my thinking. Instead of seeing my bipolar disorder as a flaw, I began to see it as part of my unique experience. It wasn't something that needed to be erased. It was something that needed to be understood and embraced. Page 3. One of the most important lessons I've learned from Dr. Maté is that every part of us, even the parts we struggle with, have value. Our vulnerabilities, our sensitivities, our emotional depth, they are all part of what makes us who we are. And when we reject those parts of ourselves, we are rejecting our own humanity. Learning to embrace all parts of myself hasn't been easy. There are still days when I feel the urge to push away the emotions that feel too intense or too painful. There are moments when I catch myself judging my mood swings or wishing that I could be more stable or consistent. But now, I have the awareness to recognize those patterns and to remind myself that all parts of me are worthy of acceptance. Dr. Maté teaches that healing is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more fully ourselves. It's about embracing the wholeness of who we are, rather than trying to fit into some idealized version of perfection. And that's what I'm learning to do. I'm learning to see my emotions, my moods, my vulnerabilities, not as flaws, but as integral parts of who I am. Page 4. As I continue to embrace all parts of myself, I've noticed that my relationship with others has started to change as well. When I allow myself to be fully seen in all of my complexity and imperfection, I create space for deeper, more authentic connections. I no longer feel the need to hide the parts of myself that I used to be ashamed of. Instead, I show up as I am, trusting that I am worthy of love and acceptance, even in my most vulnerable moments. Dr. Maté talks about how healing requires us to let go of the masks we wear, the roles we play to fit into society's expectations. This has been one of the most freeing parts of my journey. I've learned that I don't have to be perfect or always in control or always together. I can be messy, emotional, and imperfect, and that doesn't make me any less worthy of love and belonging. Embracing all parts of myself has allowed me to step into a deeper sense of self-acceptance. It's not about fixing or changing who I am. It's about honoring the wholeness of my experience, trusting that every part of me has something to offer, something to teach. And in that acceptance, I've found a sense of peace that I never thought was possible. Page 5. Healing is an ongoing process, and there are still moments when I struggle to embrace all parts of myself. But I've come to realize that healing isn't about reaching some final destination. It's about continuing to show up for ourselves day after day with compassion and acceptance. Dr. Maté's teachings have guided me toward a deeper understanding of what it means to be whole. It's not about erasing the parts of ourselves that we don't like. It's about integrating them, about seeing the beauty in our complexity, and about trusting that every part of us is worthy of love. I am still learning to embrace all parts of myself, but with each day, I'm getting better at it. I'm learning to see my bipolar disorder not as a curse, but as part of my unique experience. I'm learning to hold space for my emotions, even the difficult ones, and to trust that they are part of my journey toward healing. And most of all, I'm learning that I am whole exactly as I am. Page 6, Affirmation, I embrace all parts of myself with love and acceptance. Chapter 20, The Path to Wholeness. Page 1. Wholeness was not something I thought about much before I began this healing journey. For most of my life, I felt fragmented, as if different parts of me were constantly at odds with each other. The highs and lows of bipolar disorder only heightened that sense of disconnection. There were days when I felt like I was two different people, one who could take on the world and another who could barely get out of bed. I didn't know how to reconcile those two extremes, how to make peace with the fact that both of those versions of me were real. But as I started to delve into Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings, I began to understand that healing isn't just about managing symptoms or getting rid of the parts of ourselves we don't like. It's about becoming whole. And wholeness doesn't mean perfection. It means embracing every part of ourselves, even the parts that feel messy, broken, or out of control. It's about bringing all of those parts together into a cohesive whole, where nothing is rejected or denied. This concept of wholeness changed everything for me. I realized that I didn't need to fix myself in order to feel whole. I didn't need to eliminate the difficult parts of my personality or cure my bipolar disorder. Instead, I needed to find a way to integrate all of the parts of myself, the light and the dark, the highs and the lows, into a balanced, accepting whole. Page 2. Dr. Maté talks about how trauma can create a sense of fragmentation within us. When we experience emotional pain, especially in childhood, we often disconnect from parts of ourselves in order to survive. We might push down our emotions, suppress our needs, or create personas that help us navigate the world. But in doing so, we lose touch with the fullness of who we are. We become fragmented, and that fragmentation can make us feel lost, disconnected, and incomplete. I had spent years feeling that way, disconnected from myself, unsure of who I really was, and constantly trying to mold myself into different versions of me, depending on the situation. But as I began to heal, I realized that I didn't need to keep fragmenting myself in order to fit in or to feel safe. I could begin the process of becoming whole again, of reclaiming the parts of myself that I had lost along the way. This process wasn't easy. It required me to face the parts of myself that I had been avoiding, the emotions I didn't want to feel, the memories I didn't want to confront, the beliefs about myself that I had buried deep inside. But through Dr. Maté's teachings, I learned that in order to heal, I had to embrace all of those parts, not just the ones that were easy to love. Page 3. One of the most challenging aspects of becoming whole was learning to accept the parts of myself that I didn't like, the parts that felt too much, not enough, or out of control. My bipolar disorder had always made me feel like there was something inherently wrong with me, like I was somehow broken. But Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that these parts of myself weren't flaws to be fixed. They were pieces of my human experience, and they deserved to be embraced with compassion. As I began to embrace those parts, I started to notice something powerful. The more I accepted myself, the more integrated I felt. The highs and lows of my mood swings didn't feel as extreme when I stopped trying to fight them. I began to understand that both the manic energy and the depressive heaviness were part of the same whole, part of the same person. And that person was worthy of love, exactly as they were. Becoming whole also meant letting go of the idea that there was a right or wrong way to be. For so long, I had believed that in order to feel whole, I needed to fit into society's idea of what it meant to be stable, successful, or put together. But Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that wholeness isn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It's about honoring my own unique journey, my own unique self. Page 4. As I continued to embrace the path to wholeness, I began to reconnect with the parts of myself that I had neglected or suppressed. I started to rediscover my creativity, my sense of joy, and my love for life, things that had been overshadowed by years of focusing on managing my mental health. I realized that becoming whole didn't mean I had to be happy all the time or have everything figured out. It meant allowing space for all of my emotions, all of my experiences, and trusting that each one had a place in my journey. Dr. Maté talks about how healing isn't about reaching a final destination. It's about the process of becoming more fully ourselves, more connected to our true essence. This resonated deeply with me. I realized that the path to wholeness wasn't about fixing anything. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself that I had lost or abandoned and integrating them into a balanced, harmonious whole. Part of that process was learning to trust myself again. For so long, I had doubted my own ability to navigate life, especially with the unpredictability of bipolar disorder. But as I embraced wholeness, I began to trust that I had the inner resources to handle whatever came my way. I didn't need to be perfect or have all the answers. I just needed to show up for myself with love and acceptance. Page 5. The path to wholeness is ongoing, and I'm still walking it every day. There are moments when I feel fragmented, when the old patterns of self-doubt or self-criticism resurface. But now I have the tools to bring myself back to a place of wholeness. I remind myself that every part of me, every emotion, every experience, every mood is part of the larger whole, and that I don't need to reject or fix any of it in order to be complete. Dr. Maté's teachings have shown me that wholeness is about embracing our humanity in all of its complexity. It's about honoring our wounds, our scars, and our struggles, and seeing them not as things that make us broken, but as things that make us whole. And that's what I'm learning to do, to embrace all parts of myself, to integrate the light and the dark, and to trust that I am whole, exactly as I am. Page 6, affirmation. I am whole, just as I am, with all parts of myself in harmony. Chapter 21, Finding Freedom and Healing. Page 1, healing for me used to feel like a burden. It felt like something I had to constantly work at, something that weighed me down. I thought that in order to heal, I needed to put in endless effort, always striving to fix the parts of me that were broken. But the more I learned from Dr. Gabor Maté, the more I realized that true healing isn't about striving or struggling. It's about finding freedom. Dr. Maté talks about how trauma can create a sense of imprisonment within us. When we are carrying unresolved pain, we are often stuck in patterns of self-doubt, self-blame, and emotional turmoil. We become trapped by the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we deserve. But healing, he teaches, is about finding freedom from those patterns, freedom from the emotional chains that keep us stuck in the past. This idea of healing as freedom was new to me. I had always seen healing as something that required effort and discipline, something that I had to work at every day. But Dr. Maté helped me see that healing is not about doing, it's about being. It's about releasing the need to control or fix everything and allowing ourselves to simply be exactly as we are. Page 2. The more I embraced this concept of healing as freedom, the lighter I began to feel. I realized that I didn't need to constantly analyze my emotions, manage my moods, or work on self-improvement in order to heal. I didn't need to be perfect in my healing journey. In fact, the very idea of striving for perfection was part of what had been keeping me trapped. The freedom I was seeking wasn't something external. It was an internal shift, a release of the belief that I needed to be anything other than who I was in that moment. One of the most powerful lessons I learned from Dr. Maté is that healing happens when we let go of control. For so long, I had tried to control every aspect of my mental health. I wanted to manage my bipolar disorder perfectly, to prevent the highs from getting too high and the lows from getting too low. But that constant need for control was exhausting, and it left me feeling even more out of balance. As I started to release the need for control, I began to experience a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in years. I realized that I didn't need to micromanage every emotion or mood swing. I didn't need to have everything figured out. Healing wasn't about controlling my emotions. It was about allowing them to flow naturally, trusting that I could handle whatever came up. Page 3. Finding freedom and healing also meant letting go of the pressure to be better. I had spent years chasing the idea that I needed to improve, that I needed to fix the parts of myself that I didn't like. But the more I chased that idea, the more trapped I felt. Dr. Maté's teachings helped me see that healing isn't about becoming a better version of ourselves. It's about becoming more fully ourselves. It's about releasing the need to change who we are and instead embracing the wholeness of our being. This shift in perspective brought me a profound sense of relief. I no longer felt like I was failing when I had bad days or when my mood swings resurfaced. I stopped judging myself for not being healed enough or for not having everything figured out. Instead, I started to trust that my healing journey was unfolding exactly as it needed to, and that I didn't need to rush or force anything. Dr. Maté talks about how healing is a process, not a destination. This was a liberating realization for me. I no longer felt like I was chasing some elusive goal of being healed. I realized that healing was something that happened in the present moment. Every time I allowed myself to feel, to accept, and to let go. Healing wasn't about achieving a perfect state of well-being. It was about finding freedom in the here and now. Page 4. Another important part of finding freedom and healing was learning to let go of the expectations I had placed on myself. I had always believed that in order to heal, I needed to follow a certain path or meet certain milestones. But as I embraced Dr. Maté's teachings, I realized that healing doesn't follow a straight line. It's messy, unpredictable, and deeply personal. And that's okay. Letting go of those expectations allowed me to experience healing in a more natural, organic way. I stopped trying to force myself to heal on a specific timeline, and I started trusting that my body and mind knew what they needed. I allowed myself to rest when I needed to rest, to process emotions when they arose, and to take things one step at a time. Finding freedom and healing has been one of the most transformative parts of my journey. It has allowed me to release the pressure, the judgment, and the self-blame that I had been carrying for so long. It has given me permission to be exactly where I am, without needing to be anywhere else. And in that freedom, I found a deeper sense of peace, of acceptance, and of self-compassion. Page 5. As I continue to walk this path of healing, I remind myself that freedom is not something I need to chase. It's something I already have within me. It's the freedom to be who I am without judgment or shame. It's the freedom to feel my emotions without needing to fix or change them. And it's the freedom to trust that I am exactly where I need to be on this journey. Dr. Maté's teachings have shown me that healing isn't about escaping the pain or overcoming the challenges. It's about finding freedom in the midst of it all. It's about releasing the need to control or perfect ourselves, and instead embracing the beauty of our imperfect, messy, and wonderfully human experience. And that, for me, has been the true freedom in healing. Page 6. Affirmation: I find freedom in letting go and trusting my journey. Chapter 22. A journey of healing and hope. Page 1. As I reflect on this journey, I realize how much has changed, not just in the way I understand myself, but in the way I approach life. For so long, I thought healing was a destination, something I would eventually reach if I just worked hard enough, controlled my emotions well enough, or managed my bipolar disorder perfectly. But through Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings, I've come to see that healing isn't a destination at all. It's a journey, one that is ongoing, full of twists, turns, setbacks, and breakthroughs. And at the heart of that journey is hope. Hope is something I didn't always have. There were times, especially during my darkest moments, when hope felt impossible. When the weight of depression was too heavy, or the whirlwind of mania was too overwhelming, hope seemed out of reach. I thought I was destined to live a life of emotional chaos, always swinging between extremes, never finding peace. But Dr. Maté's teachings gave me a new perspective. He talks about how, even in our deepest pain, there is always the possibility of healing. That healing is not about becoming perfect, but about reconnecting with ourselves, our bodies, our emotions, our minds, and finding balance, compassion, and acceptance. And that in itself is hope. Page 2. Through this process, I've learned that hope doesn't mean that everything will always be easy, or that I won't face challenges. It doesn't mean that my bipolar disorder will disappear, or that I'll never experience another mood swing. Hope, for me, has come to mean something different. It's the belief that no matter what happens, I have the capacity to heal. I have the capacity to hold space for my emotions, to navigate the highs and lows, and to find peace within myself, even in the midst of chaos. There's a quote from Dr. Maté that has stayed with me throughout this journey. Healing is possible when we dare to be ourselves. This idea of daring to be ourselves, our whole, imperfect, messy, beautiful selves, has become a guiding principle in my life. For years, I tried to hide parts of myself, believing that I needed to fit into some ideal version of who I thought I should be. But now, I see that healing comes from embracing all parts of myself, from daring to be authentic, vulnerable, and real. Hope, I've learned, is not about being free from pain. It's about trusting that even in pain, there is the possibility for growth, for learning, and for deeper connection with ourselves and others. It's about believing that no matter how difficult things get, we are resilient, we are strong, and we are worthy of healing. Page 3. One of the biggest lessons I've learned on this journey is that healing is not something we do alone. There were so many times when I thought I had to handle everything by myself, when I thought that being strong meant not asking for help. But Dr. Maté's teachings showed me that true strength comes from connection. It comes from allowing ourselves to be seen, to be supported, and to be held by others when we need it most. I've found hope in the connections I've made along the way, in the friends who have listened to me without judgment, in the support groups where I've been able to share my story, and in the people who have shown me that I'm not alone in this journey. Healing is a collective process, and it's through our relationships with others that we find the strength to keep going, even when things feel hard. Hope has also come from learning to trust myself again. For so long, I doubted my ability to manage my emotions, to navigate the ups and downs of bipolar disorder. But through this journey, I've discovered that I am capable of more than I ever thought possible. I've learned to listen to my body, to honor my emotions, and to trust that I can handle whatever comes my way. Page 4. Dr. Maté's teachings have helped me see that hope isn't about waiting for things to get better. It's about finding peace and strength in the present moment, even when things are hard. It's about trusting that healing is not a linear path and that setbacks are part of the process. There will be times when things feel difficult, when old patterns resurface, when the pain feels too much to bear. But hope is knowing that these moments are not the end. They are part of the journey. As I look ahead, I know that there will still be challenges. I know that my bipolar disorder will continue to present its own unique set of difficulties. But I also know that I am no longer defined by those challenges. I am not broken. I am whole, exactly as I am, and I am capable of healing, of growth, of resilience. That, to me, is the greatest source of hope. Hope has become a quiet, steady presence in my life, a reminder that healing is always possible, even when things feel uncertain or overwhelming. It's the belief that no matter what happens, I have the tools, the strength, and the support I need to keep moving forward. Page 5. This journey has taught me that healing is not about arriving at some perfect, pain-free version of myself. It's about embracing the journey itself with all of its ups and downs, twists and turns. It's about finding peace in the process rather than in the outcome. And most of all, it's about believing in my own capacity to heal, to grow, and to thrive. As I continue on this path, I carry with me the lessons I've learned from Dr. Maté, the importance of self-compassion, the power of vulnerability, the need for connection, and the freedom that comes from letting go of control. These lessons have not only helped me heal, but they've also given me hope for the future. I know now that healing is possible. I know that I am capable of holding space for all parts of myself and that I am worthy of love, of care, and of peace. And I know that, no matter what challenges lie ahead, I can face them with hope in my heart, knowing that I am not alone on this journey. Page 6. Affirmation: I trust in my journey of healing and hold hope for all that is to come.